2022 is going to be over before we know it, which means it's time to get your 2023 calendars ordered. What would you say if I told you that you could get a calendar with some of your favorite independent true crime podcasts, including Ye Olde Crime? Pre-order your copy at podcastcalendars.com and get $5 off your order by using our promo code OLDECRIMERS. That's OLDECRIMERS. And if you order before November 30th, you can get an additional 10% off. That's podcastcalendars.com, code OLDECRIMERS. Don't miss your chance to spend May with us, and we'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.
We are
Cultivate.
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 Cultivate. We are Cultivate.
Hello and welcome to a special mini-sode of Ye Olde Crime, the show where Maddie and I discuss the funny, strange, and obscure crimes of yesteryear every Wednesday. This special bi-weekly segment is called Can You Crack the Cramp-Word, which is slang for a difficult or obscure term, which I thought was very fitting. And joining me today is John from the Secret Sits podcast. And before we begin, I'd like to give him the opportunity to tell us a little more about himself and his show before we get started.
Well, hello. I am John Dodson. I'm the host of the Secret Sits podcast. And just starting out for our podcast, we started back in February of 2021. I think when a lot of podcasts started, that pandemic itch that everybody had to scratch. I've just been a lover of true crime stories my whole entire life. And I started my life in the theater. I have a large theater background. That's what I went to college for. And one of my theater professors was Dr. Wayne Claren. And Doc, as he was known, was actually married to Judith O'Dea, who was Barbara in Night of the Living Dead. So it almost seemed fitting that there was going to be some ghoulishness that was following me.
That's
and
awesome.
That was, it was a really interesting meeting of people in my life.
Nice.
So The Secret Sits was titled after my favorite poem by Robert Frost. And I do quote that poem quite frequently in my podcast. And it is very fitting for true crime, I believe. The poem is, "We dance round in a ring and suppose, but the secret sits in the middle and knows." Which is kind of true for true crime stories, right? There's always three sides to a story. The one side, the other side, and then the truth somewhere in the middle.
So, as you mentioned, you've covered a variety of recent true crime cases, cults, not to mention some historic cases. What draws you to a case?
Good question. So on our podcast, we try not to just duplicate the same stories everyone else is doing. We pick stories purely based on our personal interest. So my husband, Gabriel Dodson, who is our audio engineer for The Secret Sits, he is also a performer. He's a vocalist, and he works a lot of the time in Japan. So we also cover true crime stories from Japan, which we don't normally hear on other podcasts. And we have a fervor to make sure that those stories are told accurately, culturally appropriate, and that sort of thing. So we pick stories based on our personal interests, very rarely what's popular currently in true crime. But we also pick stories based on how we can tell the story, because a lot of stories are retold over and over with the exact same perspective. So recently we released our 3-part plus 1 bonus episode, a series on J.C. Lee Dugard's kidnapping. But in our episodes, instead of just rehashing what happened to JC, we actually tell the story from her perspective based on her memoirs and let you experience it through her eyes rather than just someone telling you what happened to her.
Nice. Yep. That's awesome. Which is a perfect segue because your show has covered quite a range of heavy hitters. Are there any cases that you've covered that you kind of had a hard time walking away from?
There are cases, and there are are stories that are coming out this season that I'm currently working on. I do the researching and writing for our podcast that are so difficult for me to read and research and write that they take much longer than other episodes. Particularly, we will be covering the death of Matthew Shepard. And as a gay man myself, it's a hard topic to breach and to cover and feel like we are doing it the justice it deserves.
Yep.
So Columbine, when we covered Columbine, that was extremely difficult to record. One of our Japanese episodes, Junko Furuta, was extremely difficult, especially for Gabriel to edit, being so familiar with Japanese culture and living there a lot of times. It was just a really heavy episode for him to even listen to and edit. He doesn't necessarily love true crime. He's just a great audio engineer.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be very hard to edit some of those darker episodes that, like you said, have a bit of, I mean, every true crime story is not pretty. Otherwise it wouldn't be true crime, right?
Right.
They're all dark in their own way, but some of them are just a little bit worse than others.
Absolutely.
I would imagine it's a little bit more difficult to edit those kinds of episodes.
Yes.
Last question. Is there a particular case that you've either already covered on your show or plan to cover that you're either really excited about researching or it was very rewarding for you to research it, like very interesting?
I'm currently writing an episode. It'll be a 3-part episode, and it is about a serial killer preacher from Alabama in the 1920s who was also covered as one of Harper Lee's last projects, but her book actually never came out. So there's a true crime serial killer story mixed in with a mysterious story of one of the most well-known authors in American history. I'm very excited about that one. Yes.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, I loved both the books. Like, yeah.
They're so good. Yes.
They're so good. Yeah. That's why I get really frustrated when they're like, we need to ban these books because they're upsetting. That's the point.
Right, exactly. You have to teach people how the world works.
Not everything is sunshine and rainbows.
No,
sometimes things are upsetting.
Yes, yes, and we've actually, in a couple of cases that we covered recently, we covered the Sizzlers massacre from South Africa, and we actually had one of the victims' sisters reach out to us because the perpetrator of that crime's parole hearing was coming up, and they wanted the podcast's help in the parole hearing to keep him in jail. We also covered the kidnapping of Jan Broberg, and now Jan Broberg actually now follows us on our social media score, but she has they have a whole Netflix series coming out. I think it's a scripted series recounting her true crime story. So that's really interesting when we cover something and then it blows up in other ways.
Yeah, that's cool.
Oh, hello. Let me introduce myself. I am John Dotson, and I host The Secret Sits, a true crime podcast. If you're like me, you undoubtedly have quite a few podcasts you listen to on a regular basis. Now, I, for one, love a great chatty podcast with multiple hosts. It can really make you feel like you're just hanging out with some friends. But sometimes you need to chill out and relax while listening to an extraordinary true crime story with no interruptions and just the facts. The Secret Sits strives to push boundaries and present cases in an immersive storytelling atmosphere. I've spent my life working as a director, writer, and performer, and I've been fortunate enough to travel all over the world, creating art through theater, television, and film. Now I'm fervently bringing my passions for true crime cases and the arts to this podcast. Here on The Secret Sits, we cover all types of true crime, from serial killers like Eileen Wuornos and Rodney Alcala, to cults, museum heists, mass shootings, or any other cases we find interesting. Every Thursday, immerse yourself into a new episode. You may find yourself in the Aokigahara forest in Japan, or recounting the Columbine school shooting minute by minute. The Secret Sits podcast is not responsible for any loss of road rage, Calgon taking you away, being more polite in the grocery store, or suddenly becoming an armchair detective. You can find all episodes of The Secret Sits for free on all podcast platforms, including YouTube.
All right, that's all the questions that I have. So if you're ready to dive into some slang terms.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Your first term is mandrake mimmerkin.
Mandrake mimmerkin. Okay. So, of course, I think everybody would think Mandrake, Harry Potter, right?
Yep. That's where I first went when I looked at it. Yeah.
It just makes sense in our current dialect, right? Mandrake mimmerkin. So I am going to guess at this, and I would guess that this would be an article of clothing for a female to wear while gardening.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that you mentioned Harry Potter, because a mandrake mimmerkin is a little man, puppet, or childlike.
Oh,
So if you think about how the mandrakes are like little baby type things, it kind of fits.
interesting.
Yeah. The mimmerkin part was what kind of threw me off.
Yeah, that sounded like an article of clothing possibly to me.
Yep. All right. Your second term is neck or nothing.
Neck or nothing, and that's one word?
That's one phrase, yep.
One phrase, neck or nothing. So currently I'm writing an episode about killer Victorian fashion. I think that's why I keep going back to articles of clothing. Because once again, I would think that this would be an article of clothing for a male that would go around his neck.
I can give you a clue.
Okay, give me a clue.
It's a racing term.
It is a racing term. Give me the phrase again.
Neck or nothing.
Neck or nothing. Okay, so does that refer to how they determine if a horse has won a race?
Mm-hmm. So it's a horse racing term, yep.
Haha, I'm closer. I mean, yeah, I can't think of another way to describe it except for like winning by, the neck.
Mm-hmm. So neck or nothing means desperate. So like you're desperate for them to like get the neck over the line.
Okay.
Yep. So neck or nothing, desperate.
All right. We have two new words.
Yeah, two new things you can add to your lexicon.
Yes.
I don't know why you would use them, but you never know.
I have a Shakespearean episode coming out soon. Maybe I can throw one of those in there as a tribute.
There you go. There you go. Well, I would like to thank John for joining me today for Can You Crack the Cramp-Word? And before we go, can you tell our listeners when new episodes of your show come out and where they can find you on social?
Absolutely. New episodes of The Secret Sits premiere every single Thursday, anywhere you can get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. On our social media, we are on Twitter at Secret Sits Pod, and on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Secret Sits Podcast.
Awesome. Thank you again for making time to come on today. It was lovely meeting you in person.
Absolutely. You as well.
And on that note, as always, I'm Lindsay, and I'll see you next time with another tale as old as crime.